Alexander Immanuel Alfred Pache was born on 31st December 1878 in Steinigtwolmsdorf near Bautzen. Entirely committed to scholarly pursuits and, so far as we know, a lifelong bachelor, he would most happily have spent his whole life in academia if history had not intervened. After graduating from the Kreuzgymnasium in Dresden in 1899, he first studied law and economics in Leipzig, then German philology, philosophy, and history in Leipzig and Bonn. From 1901 to 1905, he worked as a tutor and teacher at the Evangelisches Pädagogium in Godesburg near Bonn, while working toward further qualifications. In December 1904, Pache obtained his doctorate with a thesis on the poetry of Heinrich Heine. From October 1905 to 1906, he finally completed his military service obligation as an Einjährig Freiwilliger in Dresden, exemplifying how peacetime service as a one-year volunteer could be flexibly arranged around the demands of an academic career for those who could afford it. Dr. Pache then completed a probationary year teaching at his old school before being appointed to the König Georg Gymnasium in Dresden-Johannstadt at Easter 1907. He was still teaching at this school, with the senior job title of Gymnasial Oberlehrer, when the war broke out. A cultured and sensitive man whose letters are adorned with wit and classical allusion, Pache was clearly more at home in the classroom or lecture hall than in the trenches. However, like many professional men in Imperial Germany, including many teachers, he was also, since 1912, a reserve officer, and at mobilization he became a platoon commander in the 11th Company of Infantry Regiment 182. This was both Saxony's and Germany's youngest peacetime infantry regiment, formed in October 1912 and garrisoned in the picturesque medieval mining town of Freiberg, sometimes styled as a city since it possesses both a cathedral and a university. In 1914, the regiment fought as part of 23rd Infantry Division in the invasion battles and on the Marne, ending the year holding the line north of Reims. Pache had already been wounded for the first time that August, but only lightly. When the 23rd was reduced from 4 to 3 infantry regiments in March 1915, IR 182 became part of the new 123rd Infantry Division. This was an independent formation, a so-called flying division at the disposal of OHL, German High Command, and as such was soon moved to reserve billets in the Lille area. After briefly filling in holding sectors near Lens and in the Wytschaete salient, that is on Messines Ridge in British terms, the division was committed in August to the vital and murderous Souchez sector, on partly flooded low ground overlooked by the French from the heights of Notre-Dame-de-Lorette. Subjected to the full weight of the French offensive on 25th September 1915, IR 182 alone lost 39 officers and 1,250 other ranks killed, wounded or missing within 4 days. Although himself wounded, Pache remained in action and assumed acting command of the 8th Company on 29th of September in place of the slain Oberleutnant von Mucke, a pre-war career officer. The next day, the regiment was withdrawn to immediate reserve, where it received large replacement drafts and began rebuilding. 2 weeks later, 123rd Infantry Division returned to Wytschaete, initially holding exactly the same sector as it had in July, with its regiments in the same subsectors. Whilst in the field, Pache would maintain a lively correspondence with family and friends, in between the relentless demands of his duties as a platoon and later company commander. For example, the Universitätsbibliothek Leipzig holds his correspondence with Eduard Zahnke, editor of the Literarisches Zentralblatt für Deutschland, a literary periodical. The publicly available summaries of these letters indicate that Pache discussed both his war experiences and literary questions with Zahnke, and was even writing reviews for publication from the trenches. Our second book, for King and Kaiser, includes a whole chapter of Pache's letters from the Wytschaete salient, previously published only in Saxon veterans' newspapers in the early 1930s, and, to our knowledge, never before translated into English. The names of the recipients of these letters were omitted in Pache's published text and have not been identified. The following is an excerpt from one such letter, addressed from the Wytschaete trenches. It is dated 28th January 1916, only a day after the events it describes. In the afternoon, the enemy artillery suddenly opened a half-hour's drum fire on the second trench in our reserve line. We hadn't heard such a racket since Souchez. Luckily, my detachment was spared. Only a couple of heavy shells and shrapnel pots went onto the second line of our position. However, they did drive us out of the dugout, which rang in all its brand new joints at every distant or close impact. Outside, we observed how the howling masses of iron went over us towards Wytschaete, the Rote Villa, the Zahnstockerwald, and the Saxon Graben. Then suddenly, a huge flame arose among the shot-denuded spruce trunks of the so-called Zahnstockerwald. The name very aptly describes the state of the remaining trees, and dense smoke welled skyward. The dugout was burning. It was the company commander's dugout in the so-called immediate reserve position. Every 2 weeks, I too am there for 6 days, together with batmen and orderlies. When the artillery duel had died down somewhat, I sent my orderlies up there and allowed myself to make inquiries. Meanwhile, the commander of the company there, Rittmeister C, was already being sought after by telephone throughout the regimental sector. He had first been transferred to our regiment after Souchez. Around evening it became a tragic certainty that, along with his batman and orderly, he had been burned and buried in the dugout. It was only today that the 3 bodies could be excavated. Before the World War, death on the field of battle was for every man surely an occurrence more or less enveloped in poetry. But in reality it is for the most part so heavily accompanied by terrible, even sickening details that one understands why poetry must subsequently exert its mitigating, transfiguring effect, if man is at least to be able to bear it in memory. Nothing is so unpoetic, so gruesomely prosaic as such a death. Therefore, poetry must come and elevate it into the sphere of the high and the beautiful, out of the realms of filth, stench, and loathsome hardship. You wouldn't believe what an effect the sight of the first snowdrop has after such an experience. I found it blooming in the ruined and overgrown garden of the so-called Einodhof, which lies in the meadow right behind our trench. And the day before, I had heard the first starling singing on the barren, shattered stumps of the Zahnstockerwald. A starling, a snowdrop. When one sees dear and diligent men die in such a terrible and needlessly gruesome way, one may doubt God's goodness. But the first twittering of birds, the first shy bloom of the coming spring, lets us fervently believe in it again. As my wife has pointed out, the snowdrops and the return of migrating starlings at the end of January would have been among the very first signs of the change of season. It is striking that even after a second winter at war, major battles, and the deaths of many colleagues, among them no doubt many friends, Pache seems to have sincerely retained the instincts and aesthetic ideals of a romantic poet. Though we know of no poems written by Pache, there is of course ample evidence of his strong scholarly interest in the field of poetry. The profoundly unfortunate Rittmeister C is identified in Pache's regimental history as Rittmeister der Reserve Theodor Walter Coccius, born in Leipzig on 13th October 1878. This recently promoted ex-cavalry officer from Saxon Ulan Regiment 17 had been commander of 6th Company IR 182 since 27th October 1915. Pache had therefore known and worked with Coccius for at least 3 months. The regimental history records the latter's death very briefly as follows. On 27th January, for the Kaiser's birthday, from 4 to 6 p.m., heavy bursts of artillery fire across the entire sector, in course of which Rittmeister der Reserve Coccius, Kompanie-Führer of the 6th, fell in his dugout together with 2 orderlies. Only 2 other men of 6th Company IR 182 are reported as killed in the same Verlustlist as Coccius, dated 18th February 1916, and so are presumably the orderlies, Gefreiter Bruno Fuchs from Bernichen and Soldat Kurt Richter from Reichenbach. My choice of subject here was inspired by the crowd-funded excavations at Hill 80 in Wytschaete, which we have had the honour of assisting with research on textual and photographic sources. The same archaeological team has also unearthed evidence of the Kortestollen, a huge accommodation gallery constructed by the Prussians who took over Wytschaete from the Saxons in March 1916. For battlefield tourists, however, the most obvious attraction in this area is the reconstructed trench system at Bayernwald. This small wood north of Wytschaete was certainly known by that name to Pache during his residence, when it was held partly by IR 182, but mostly by their right-hand neighbour, IR 178. To the Flemish, this wood was Krunaert or Krunaert Bos, and accordingly became Krunaert Wood to the British. They also knew it as Wood 40, referring, like the French Bois 40, to the height above sea level, from which it dominated the terrain to the north and west. This vital ground had been seized from the French by the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division on 16th of November 1914, after many days of hard fighting. In their honour, the former Beilwald, Axe Wood, became Bayernwald, Bavarian Wood, on German maps. In 1915, the wood extended much further than today, not only towards St. Eloi, but also into part of the field opposite the current entrance. Here lay the front line, plagued from the outset by sloping ground, high groundwater, and flanking artillery fire directed from Mont Kemmel, the Kemmelberg. It was supported on either flank by German positions at Hollandsche Schur Farm, held at this time by IR 182, and St. Eloi, held at this time by IR 178. Both locations already targeted by British tunnellers and destined for destruction on 7th of June 1917. In the winter of 1915-16, however, the greatest concern for the Saxons was the rising water level, which collapsed trenches and rendered parts of Bayernwald uninhabitable. As a result, the Prussians who followed them began work that summer on a new, deeper trench system behind and uphill of the old line. This new line then became the main position from February 1917. The current reconstructed Bayernwald trenches represent only a small part of this newer trench system. 123rd Infantry Division was relieved in mid-March 1916. After an extended period in Flanders as a source of working parties and temporary reliefs for other units, it was committed to the Battle of the Somme on 7th July. Having survived being buried alive under British bombardment, Pache would later be awarded the Ritterkreuz of the Saxon Militärischen Heinrichsorden for his performance as company commander in the fighting for Trones Wood. By the end of the war, he is also known to have been decorated with the Ritterkreuz second class of the Albrechtsorden, as well as both classes of the Iron Cross. IR 182 would subsequently become possibly the most widely travelled infantry regiment in the entire Saxon army. It accompanied the battered 123rd Infantry Division to the Eastern Front at the beginning of August 1916, but soon left to become part of the newly formed and otherwise Prussian 216th Infantry Division. After fighting the Russians in Galicia with the mixed Austro-German Ottoman Sudarmee, the new division travelled to Transylvania that November and took on the Romanians in the Battle of the Olt Valley, where Pache was severely wounded. Still on the Romanian front, in August 1917, IR 182 was transferred for the final time, joining the low-grade Saxon 212th Infantry Division. By this time, Pache had been promoted to Oberleutnant der Reserve and returned to duty, but neither he nor IR 182 would see any more major battles. In April 1918, 212th Infantry Division was shipped across the Black Sea to support the German-backed Ukrainian government, the Hetmanate. IR 182 spent most of its time in Ukraine, based at Melitopol, with its men dispersed across the surrounding area in penny packets, fighting anarchist and Bolshevist bands and attempting to organize the local Black Sea German communities, many of them pacifist Mennonites, for self-defense against these raiders. The regiment had the good fortune to be transported home by the end of the year and demobilized, while other units of its division were trapped in Ukraine as it descended into civil war and were not shipped home until March 1919. After demobilization, Pache returned to teaching at the König Georg Gymnasium in Dresden, and later at other schools in Zwickau and Leipzig, eventually gaining the title of professor. He was also highly active in IR 182's Veterans Association, and his Letters from the Somme appeared in its published history, for which he also served as the main author in 1924. His letters from the Wytschaete salient were serialized in the 1930s by the Saxon veterans newsletter Der Feldkamerad. His other known publications include numerous works on German poetry, including volumes on the place of the wars of 1864, 1866, 1870-71, and 1914-1918 in German literature. In 1933, Pache served as a member of the Saxon Landtag, the parliament, for the Kampffront Schwarz-Weiß-Rot, an alliance of the national conservative Deutschnationale Volkspartei, the Stahlhelmbund Monarchist Veterans Federation, and the Reichslandbund Agricultural League. Given his known associations, it seems most likely that he was representing the Stahlhelm. Tragically and shamefully, this highly decorated and courageous officer would ultimately die on 7th December 1943 as an inmate of Buchenwald concentration camp. According to camp records found online by my wife Diana, the 64-year-old Pache died of acute Kreislaufschwäche, acute weakness of the blood circulation. This vague and widely used diagnosis suggests death from overwork, exhaustion, and hunger. How, where, and when he fell foul of the National Socialist state is currently unclear.